Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello and welcome to mini episode 347 of Real Life Ghost Stories, and I have 2 spooky stories for you today, and the last story comes from March the 14th, 2024, and story number 1 comes from Amy. I want to start by saying my mum and I are quite in tune with the spiritual world. My mother more than I. When I was a young teenager, my parents bought 2.5 acres of land in Australia to build their forever home. On the block was a long white section that we called the cricket pitch due to its resemblance. Nothing grew on this pitch, and there was always an uneasy feeling when standing on top. A couple of years later we moved into the home, and that's when it all began. It started with cupboard doors slamming in the kitchen, but it soon turned for the worse. There was a glass panel door that separated the lounge room to the hallway with all the bedrooms. My sister had a daughter around the age of 2. My dad, a full-blown skeptic, had an experience while he was sitting in the lounge room watching TV late one night when he saw the hand of a child reach across to open the door. He blew it off thinking it was my niece, but because she was so little she couldn't reach the door handle. One night my sister and her now husband were asleep when he woke up complaining to my sister to get off him. It was so heavy on his chest and he couldn't breathe. When my sister woke to him, she realised something was pinning her down by the ankles also. I am a type 1 diabetic. One night I woke in the middle of the night having a hypo. I got off my bed and went to my fridge that sat next to it, where it housed my medication and some sugar for nights like this. It was a shiny stainless steel bar fridge. I grabbed out some lollies, closed the fridge and sat in front of it. After a second, realising there was a shadow reflecting in my fridge, my aircon light emitted enough light to show a shadow, I suspect. In a fright, I jumped back and turned around, not noticing anyone there. Whenever I felt uneasy there, I would call for my granny who had passed away when I was very little. She always kept me safe when I needed her. It took a while for my mum to tell me this, due to my age and knowing that I have similar capabilities as her. She was up early one morning and in the rumpus room. She stopped dead in her path as a tall black shadow was in front of her on the other side of the room. She started politely asking it to move on and that it has no place here. It didn't listen. It began to get closer and closer to her. She screamed at it, telling it not to come any closer, and used all of her energy to do so. It eventually disappeared, but not before making her feel frightened and unwelcome. My niece would always say that she was playing with her friend when no one was there. One of the spirits would also visit her in her room at night, and we would often wake to her screaming and crying, taking a long time to settle her. I always felt like you were being watched every minute you were in that house, and never felt comfortable leaving my back vulnerable. As I got older and moved out, I would always, and to this day 17 years later, dream about a maid in that house choking me and warning me never to return. My family does not live there anymore. I spoke to my mum recently about it and explained what I felt was the spirits that lived there. It was a husband and wife and a little girl around 8 years old. The mother and daughter wore white dresses and the father was in a tux. But there was another member. Back in this era, Aboriginal people were slaves, and I believe this slave and the mother may have fallen for each other, and it was the angry father disrupting the family. When I explained this to my mum, she said she had the same vision. But here's the twist. When I met my now husband, his parents lived in the house across the road with 3 acres separating the houses. To this day, when I visit my mother and father-in-law's house, I feel the presence of another woman dressed in the same clothes. This woman seems harmless, but I can't help but feel uneasy, even with her. I do not blame you for feeling uneasy, to be honest. It always fascinates me in stories when people are like, I have this ghost in the house, but it's fine, like she doesn't make me feel uncomfortable, or he doesn't make me feel uncomfortable or whatever. And I'm like, how? How do you not feel uneasy or uncomfortable in this situation? The vision of your dad like sitting watching TV and seeing the hand of a child reach out to open the door is absolutely traumatizing. That is horrendous. I do think it's lovely that you've always been able to call on your grandmother who passed away to look after you in times where you're feeling scared or anxious, or if there's something else in the room with you. I wonder what it is about certain spirits and certain entities, etc., that only seem to be able to appear in like shadow form. I will never understand the spirit world. How great is your mum though to be able to stand her ground and be like, no, I'm politely asking you to leave. Okay, you're not listening. Well, then I'm going to aggressively ask you to leave. It must be such a terrifying thing to be able to interact with the spirit world. A gift I would not welcome. And it's so fascinating that you and your mum had the same vision. I wonder if there's a way of looking up like who had lived on the land beforehand to see if there's any truth in the vision that you and your mum had.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, what the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass f- So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
And story number 2 comes from Kayleigh. It's been almost 3.5 years since my last email to you, and a lot has happened since then. Andy and I are now married. Some things never change though, as the spooky shit is still going on around us. And I thought it was about time that I wrote to you again. The first story I have for you is from Andy's old workplace. And this happened in late 2020 or early 2021. He was working night shifts and usually worked alone, or with just one other person. He regularly heard the sound of footsteps on wooden floor coming from upstairs, which is a carpeted area, when no one was up there. He later found out that the building used to be offices with a ballroom area upstairs, which would of course have a wooden floor back then. One night he had to get something from upstairs and saw a man in an old-fashioned business suit standing there just looking at him. He spoke out loud to him and explained that he was just doing his job and he'd be gone in a couple of minutes. The man nodded. Andy looked away for a second, and when he looked back, the man had disappeared. A few days later, Andy had to go upstairs again and heard the footsteps while he was up there. So he said out loud, "It doesn't have to be now, but if someday you ever have a way of giving me your name, I'll be happy to use it instead of calling you the man upstairs." As soon as he finished the sentence, a voice inside his head said the name Arthur very loudly and very clearly. He was startled, but just said thank you and went back downstairs. A few days after that, his colleague was trying to move these huge heavy car batteries, the same type with the levers on top, from one side of the yard to the other, and then changing the levers from down to up ready to be used in the morning. One of the levers absolutely would not budge. The levers themselves are heavy as well, and they can be tricky to move. So after a couple of minutes of struggling, he just gave up and went to fetch the next battery from the other side of the yard. When he came back, the lever was sticking straight up in the air. No one had been near it. There was no rational explanation for it happening. Like I said, these things are super difficult to move. And there was only Andy and his colleague in the yard. The colleague fetched Andy and showed him what had happened and then said, "I'm not sure if you believe in this sort of thing, but weird stuff happens here all the time." And Andy said, "Oh, you mean like the man upstairs?" His colleague was shocked and asked who had told him about that, and Andy said, "No one." He was on day shifts for a couple of weeks after that, and the yard was super busy and hectic, so if anything happened, he didn't notice. Until one day, when he was working nights again. He came home visibly shaken, so I asked what had happened. He was working alone with his back to the door when he heard the footsteps coming from upstairs and walked downstairs towards him, like stomping, angrily. He thought it was his colleague, so turned around and saw a person walking past the doorway. It was so dark, so he couldn't see a face, but he still thought it was his colleague. But then his colleague shouted at him from the other side of the yard. I'm talking like at least 150 metres away. He could not have gotten that far away in literally 2 seconds. Nothing happened for the rest of that week of night shifts, but that experience did shake him up because of how aggressive and angry the footsteps were. The next time we worked nights after that, I was at home just doing my thing, pottering around the house, and suddenly I had this feeling of, you need to text Andy right now and tell him not to talk to the ghost tonight. And just this horrible gut instinct that something bad was going to happen if he did. The feeling was so distinct and insistent, but I just convinced myself I was being silly and not to bother him at work, so I didn't text him. The next day after he woke up, he told me about how active the spirit had been, and his colleague came to him and told him he had just actually seen the ghost for the first time. And although nothing terrible or dangerous happened, one of the machines also refused to work, which could have potentially been dangerous, which is what I think my bad feeling was about. From Andy's perspective of the night, things were being moved around, footsteps aplenty, the door upstairs slammed shut, and the machine he was using just would not work. Basically, there's a button on the machine, and if you press the button while using it, the machine won't work. It also won't work if the machine is jammed. It was as though someone was holding the button down, like he could see it depressed down, as though it was stuck there with no one pushing it. The problem is, if he had tried to unjam the machine and that button had popped back up, he could have lost fingers or anything in the slicer. I think that may have been what my horrible feeling was about. Anyway, lots of activity going on, and then Andy's colleague walks up to him and says, "I've just seen him." Andy was confused, thinking there was just the two of them in the yard, but his colleague insists, "No, I've just seen him, upstairs for the first time." He describes the man he saw, and it was the same description as the man Andy had seen previously, except this time he was wearing a kind of brown coat over the top of his suit. All in all, I think Andy was very happy to finish his shift early that morning. The next night he was trying to move some huge heavy-duty road signs, approximately the size of a double bed, and couldn't find the one that he was looking for. The signs were stacked upright, leaning against the wall. You cannot move these signs more than 2 at a time because they are so large and so heavy. While he was searching for the one he needed, around 6 or 7 moved forward away from the stack onto the floor gently, as though someone had placed them down rather than them falling to show exactly the one he was looking for. It was as though Arthur was helping him out to make up for being a dick the night before. But as for the physics, a lot of force is needed to move them, especially to move that many at the same time. There is no way they could have been blown by wind or anything like that. This next story is a fairly long one. It all started around July 2021 and is still happening now. I thought we apparently had a ghost cat in our house. One day in October 2021, I was in the shower, and through the glass shower screen I saw my cat out of the corner of my eye jump down from the windowsill. I heard the paws land on the tiled floor, it's a very distinctive sound, and looked around expecting to see my cat Tink in the bathroom with me. There was nothing there, and the door was fully closed. She was in the hallway on the stairs, and the stairs are carpeted, so it doesn't make even a similar noise to what I heard. Plus, I saw a cat jump down. She does it fairly often, so I know what it looks like and sounds like. Anyway, I told Andy about it when I got out of the shower, and he said, "Oh, well, I wasn't going to say anything, but I've seen an actual shadow cat around the house before, a few times. Not just out of the corner of his eye either. He actually walked through it that same morning because he opened the bedroom door to leave for work, and it was just sat there outside the door waiting for us to get up. There were other things around the house that I had just written off as tink. I'd never paid any attention to them before, but realised it had been the ghost cat all along. For example, the time when I could have sworn I heard Tink meowing at the front door to be let inside, and went to check 4 to 5 times, and every time there was nothing there. She was actually asleep in the bedroom at the time. I wrote about this experience in the supergroup, and someone in the comments warned me, saying they also had what they thought was a ghost cat, but it turned out to be something much darker. Well, they were right. This thing is not a cat. The longer it stuck around, the more obvious it became. It moved weirdly, like its limbs were too long for its body, and brought a sense of darkness, unease, and foreboding. We still see it all the time, usually out of the corner of my eye. I saw it jump up onto the bed recently, turned around to pet Tink, and she wasn't there. We've told it to leave multiple times. It's no longer welcome. It usually listens for a few days, but always comes back eventually. The next story is a much shorter one, and it's a similar experience to your story that time when you heard a single plucked guitar string in your house. I had not been sleeping well at the time, and Andy was ill, so both of us were just lying in bed awake when we heard this very clear, what can only be described as a chime. It sounded like when people tap a knife against a big wine glass. It was that specific note and sound. Just one chime, clear as crystal. I said, "What was that?" And Andy said, "I don't know, I thought it was your phone." But it wasn't my phone. My phone didn't make that noise, and it was on silent anyway. I thought it was you putting your drink down, and you clinked the glass or something. And he said, "I don't have a glass, only a plastic bottle, and I wasn't touching it." Neither of us had moved a muscle when it rang out. We discussed it a bit more, and we were definitely talking about the same sound. He described it the exact way that I was thinking of. And then he said, "It's not the first time I've heard it. I heard it once before, but I just assumed it was your phone." Twice in one morning with no logical explanation. So we Googled it. Apparently, according to everything we could find, it was a spiritual thing, and hearing it is meant to signify a wedding celebration. We got married 6 weeks later. I guess the universe was happy for us and wanted to let us know or something. Not a scary story, but kind of weird and inexplicable. 7 months after we got married, Andy's dad, my father-in-law, sadly passed away. He was a wonderful, kind man who loved his family very much and welcomed me into it with open arms. He would always greet me with a "hello, my darling" every time I saw him, sitting in the same armchair with a cup of tea and telling everyone who would listen how ours was the best wedding he had ever been to. He was very loved. Andy and I got married on the 1st of August 2022 and were supposed to be going away on our honeymoon in March 2023. For weeks before, I had a horrible gut feeling that something bad was going to happen and that we needed to move the honeymoon dates. Andy wouldn't listen, telling me I was being ridiculous and it would all be fine. Until I finally told him firmly, "No, you need to listen to me. Something is telling me that we need to move this. I just know it. Please, can we move it to June?" And he finally gave in. We saw Andy's dad in hospital on the Thursday, cheerful and right as rain, telling all the nurses about the best wedding he'd ever been to, while waiting for the doctor to confirm his pre-op. We were supposed to be flying out that Sunday, if we hadn't rescheduled the dates. His dad was to be released from hospital on the Monday, but on Monday afternoon, Andy got a call to come to the hospital immediately and say his goodbyes. His dad passed away in the early hours of Tuesday morning. Had we flown out on the Sunday, there is no way we would have made it back in time to say goodbye, because it was more than a 13-hour flight each way. I'm so glad I listened to my gut instinct. This past Christmas was our first without Andy's dad. We spent Christmas dinner with Andy's mom, and as she went back into the kitchen for something, she left the door to the dining room ajar so Andy could see the living room from where he was sitting. And there, sat in his same old armchair, was Andy's dad, a full-body apparition watching TV. Some comfort that he was with us on what was a hard day for all of us. That is the last story I have for you today. Andy is now currently working in a hospital. As you know by now, he is very in tune with vibes and presences, etc. 2 days ago, there was an intense feeling of sad loneliness as someone or something walked past. Yesterday, he was speaking with a client and another lady approached the desk. He said, "I'll be with you in just a minute." She didn't acknowledge him or react at all, but the first client gave him an odd look. He didn't think anything of it and finished up with the client and turned towards the woman who was no longer there. He called out, "Hello," assuming that she had just moved into a blind spot or something. A colleague who was walking past said, "Are you talking to me?" And he said, "No, I'm talking to the woman who was just here." The colleague told him there was no woman there, looked up and down both ends of the corridor. There was no one else around. She could not have vanished that quickly in the few seconds it took Andy to finish up with the first client, as it was a very long corridor. Then this morning, I received a text from him. The ghost is real and is a pain in the ass. As he arrived at work this morning, he pulled into the hospital grounds and heard a whistling 4-note tune come from the back seat of his car directly behind his head. This is still a very new story in our lives, so I'll update you if anything else happens. He's only been working at the hospital for 6 months, and these aren't even the first stories he's had from the place. Hospitals are weird, man. Hospitals are indeed very weird places, and you know what? I feel so sorry for Andy. Andy seems to be at the receiving end of a lot of spooky shit, and I don't know how he would put up with that. I love the continuity of the upstairs part of Andy's work being a ballroom, you know, or previously having been a ballroom. Like obviously now it's carpeted, but he's still hearing footsteps on a wooden floor. And of course, if people are going to a ballroom back in the day, the floor is going to be wooden. It's going to be that shiny wooden, so you can kind of glide around it effortlessly. So you would be hearing footsteps on a wooden floor. And then seeing that man who is all decked out in his finery, like he is still treating it as a ballroom. And is it possible that this man, I don't know, either was very attached to the ballroom or even died at the ballroom and therefore gets a bit annoyed with the type of work that is going on in his once very important place? But it does also sound like, you know, at times this entity, this man, this ballroom man can be very helpful. So it really is swings and roundabouts in the paranormal world. And your story about the cat, well, alleged cat that is haunting your house reminds me of stories that I've read about people seeing sort of, how do I describe them? Like long-legged, black, shadowy creatures on all fours in various parts of the world. So I guess the best way to describe it is like a black blob on 4 legs, just ambling around. And this sounds pretty similar. Is this just another example of a mimic where, you know, we've had so many stories over the years where mimics take on the form of a loved one or a family member, etc., etc. Is this the same thing, except just taking on the form of a cat? And as for the chimes, like, I don't even know what to tell you about that one. I still think about that time that guitar string just plucked in our bedroom randomly. I still think about it because it was so bizarre, and it was definitely not next door. Never heard anything like it before or since. It was so strange. But listen, that's quite nice. Maybe it was the universe saying congratulations on your wedding, your upcoming nuptials. That's quite sweet. And I guess if the loss of your father-in-law is demonstrative of anything, it's that you really should listen to your gut instinct about things. Our gut instinct is a very powerful thing. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Thank you to Amy and Kayleigh for sending in your stories. Remember, the last story came from March the 14th, 2024. And if you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
Why don't more infant formula companies use organic, grass-fed whole milk instead of skim? Why don't more infant formula companies use the latest breast milk science? Why don't more infant formula companies run their own clinical trials? Why don't more infant formula companies use more of the proteins found in breast milk? Why don't more infant formula companies have their own factories instead of outsourcing their manufacturing? We wondered the same thing. So we made ByHeart, a better formula for formula. Learn more at byheart.com.